Welcome to today's OR Today webinar. We're excited to have you join us as we have Jamie Zerbinski as our presenter today. A little more on Jamie a moment later, but I want to first thank today's sponsor, Key Surgical. Key Surgical, now part of STERIS, provides solutions needed for various processes and infection prevention, as well as sterile, ready-to-use products for the operating room. Additional support includes industry-accredited education courses as well as in-service training for your department, whether it's in-person or virtual. For more information on today's sponsor, please visit their website, keysurgical.com. As a reminder to our attendees, we are going to have a live Q&A at the end of today's presentation. As you're watching today's webinar, feel welcome to submit your question at any time. You can use the question feature on your webinar dashboard to submit your question. Today's webinar is eligible for one continuing education hour. You can obtain your certificate by completing the post-webinar survey. This survey will be emailed 1 hour after the completion of the webinar. You must complete the survey to receive the CE certificate. You'll be able to download your certificate directly to your computer. If you have any questions, you can reach us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. As I mentioned earlier, Jamie Zerbinski is our presenter today. Jamie is the clinical educator for sterile processing at Key Surgical. She has an active role in sterile processing industry as an in-person and virtual speaker at medical facilities and educational seminars around the U.S. Jamie has been a part of the sterile processing industry since 2013, supporting the critical process of instrument cleaning, decontamination, and sterilization in sterile processing departments across the country through products, solutions, and training. She works with SP staff to develop, share, and implement best practices based on recommendations by governing bodies such as AAMI, HSPA, SGNA, and AORN. Passionate about patient safety, Jamie recently joined a sterile processing department in Minnesota as SP technician. As an industry advocate for excellence, working alongside SP professionals allows Jamie to continue to understand real-world challenges in instrument cleaning and reprocessing. Jamie has been a contributing author on the topic of sterile processing in many industry publications, such as OR Today, Healthcare Purchasing News, Process, and more. Jamie is working towards her CIS and CHL certification and is an active member of HSPA. Jamie, you may begin whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that great introduction, and thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic, inspection and assembly, more than just prep and pack. There's so many steps in reprocessing. Then it's not just prepping and packing instruments. They're complex instruments that you are working with in the operating room. And today we're going to dive into those specifics of why, how, what, and when we do certain things in sterile processing to prep the operating room for success for that patient in the room. I like to do a little bit about me typically before I get started, because though we're all in the healthcare industry, we are people. And it's nice to kind of know a little bit about who I am outside of my contributions to the healthcare industry. I love to travel, traveling around the country, even within Minnesota, which is where my home base is and where I'm presenting from today. I like to go and explore the world and see what it has to offer. Me and my boyfriend have had a couple opportunities to travel overseas and to Hawaii. As I know things are slowly opening back up, hopefully we have an opportunity to get out and explore the world. If you ever have more than 2 minutes to talk with me, you know I'm obsessed with corgis. We just recently rescued that middle one in the middle there. His name is Clyde. He is 9 months old, and the bottom picture is Kippy. She's been with me for almost 6 years, and she is unsure of the puppy, but it's been a lot of fun, and it's a lot of fun having him around. So if you have any questions about corgis at the end, I'd love to answer those too. And then lastly, family. Family is so important, especially when we talk about the healthcare industry and being a part of a bigger thing than just reprocessing instruments or being a part of that instrument reprocessing cycle. So family is important to me. They're the backbone of who I am, and I wouldn't be able to do anything that I do here today without their support. Here's a quick disclaimer for you guys. This presentation comes from a research-based source. It's all educational. It doesn't change the facility policy that you currently have, published guidelines, standards, manufacturers' instructions for use, any local, state, or federal law. So if you have any questions about the presentation, like I said, there's a Q&A at the end. We'd love to chat about it, but this is all coming from an educational, research-based source. Here are the objectives today. I'm not going to read them, but a lot of the things that I just talked about with that introduction, we're going to talk about the do's and don'ts of assembly, what we go through an inspection of the instruments and prepping them for the OR use when it comes to the specific instruments, along with the packaging material that we use to maintain sterility all the way through the processing cycle. When we talk about instrumentation, we have to talk about preventative maintenance programs. It's a great way to be proactive in the maintenance of the instruments and facilities, taking necessary steps to prevent damages to your instruments rather than waiting for until that damage is done. Things like rusting, pitting, dull edges, broken box locks, things I'm sure you've seen in your department. Well, it'll help you save money in the department and actually help minimize the cost of repair and replacements of those instruments. It helps maximize the instrument investment. As we know, instruments are a very large investment for hospitals, and it helps extend that lifespan so they can keep working properly for as long as possible. It's kind of like that same concept of when you go to the dentist, you go for your regular checkups so that you can help minimize the risk for tooth decay or cavities that may happen. So same sort of concept, making sure that we're constantly checking these instruments. And that's not something that just sterile processing does. It's something that we rely heavily on the operating room as well. Instrument care and protection programs are like health insurance for your instruments. So making sure that you have those daily check-ins, making sure that you are checking instrumentation as often as possible, and not just assuming that everything we do in sterile processing, same thing in operating room, that you guys are checking them and inspecting them just as often as we are too. There are things that we have to consider though when we talk about programs like this, or proactive. It takes time to do these things and establish a good policy at a facility. It often takes resources. It's not something that just kind of comes out of thin air. There are cleaning and there are repairs that do happen on instruments. It's kind of the way of life when it comes to instrumentation. But if we can maintain a program that is proactive again rather than reactive, and making sure that we have the correct tools in the department to clean these and get them prepared for that inspection and assembly of the instrument and instrument sets. There's a lot of steps that happen before we actually get to this part in the reprocessing cycle. So all those things are critical for instrumentation before we actually get to the practice of inspecting and assembling these instrument sets. And last thing I want to talk about is testing. There's a lot more activity in departments to actually test for clean. So after they go through that decontamination process and make their way into the clean side in inspection and assembly, things like ATP testing, protein testing, hemoglobin tests are something that are regularly happening. Again, those cost money, they are resources for a department, but there is next level of inspection that is happening at these points in the reprocessing cycle. I just want to kind of show the reprocessing cycle. So where we're going to be at a lot for today is inspection, pack and prep, which is that red tile. We'll move a little bit through sterilization and sterile storage, and then essentially transport back to the operating room. So there, like you can see, and like I mentioned, there's a lot of predetermined steps that have to happen before we actually get to this part. And we have a ton of education on that. So if you guys are looking for additional in-depth information about that, please go to keysurgical.com/education, and we have some more education about that. But like I said, we're sticking to inspection and pack and prep today. So first thing that happens in the sterile processing department in this inspection phase of the reprocessing cycle is that we are looking specifically at instruments. So there's a lot of critical steps, especially when it comes to visual inspection. There are quite a few different places that we need to consider. Initially, a lot of things that we look at are hinged instruments. There's a lot of tricky areas like the jaws and the box locks. It's important to inspect these areas to make sure that no residual surgical soil is present. It's imperative that a department train and address visual inspection of instrumentation in their policies and their standard operating procedures. Every single instrument, every single time, because that one time that an instrument doesn't get inspected could be that one time that a dirty instrument makes its way back up to the operating room and could potentially be used on a patient. Next up, if you have identification tape at your facility, make sure that we inspect the tape every single time. And if it's flawed, chipped, or falling off, that we replace that tape and that we add a new piece of tape onto that instrument. Next, we move into physical inspection. So what we actually do in sterile processing is we manipulate and move those hinged instruments to ensure they are moving freely and functioning properly. If an instrument feels sticky or doesn't easily move as we're actually manipulating it, we can apply a lubrication, or if it's really too far gone, we pull that instrument from the set and send it out for repair. Next, we continue to assemble the set with a replacement instrument. Sharpness testing is the last physical inspection that we need for these cutting tools. For scissors, use the appropriate sharpness test and media thickness. For scissors that are shorter than 4.5 inches, use a thinner test media, which is typically of a yellow color. And for scissors that are longer than 4.5, use a thicker test media, which is typically red in color. So what happens in the department is we physically snip or cut into that test media. After several cuts, if the scissors make a clean, crisp cut without any pinching or grabbing the material, they actually pass the sharpness test. And this should be every sort of sharp instrument should be a sharpness test. We should test that almost every single time. Additionally, for caissons and other rongeurs, the cutting matrix needs to be sturdier because the instrument is designed to cut bone and other dense tissue. So using things like an index card to make sure that it actually creates a clean punch out of the card. Next up is osteotomes. They also need to be verified for sharpness, and how you do that is by running it down a plastic dowel. If the cut isn't clean, we need to pull that instrument to be sharpened or repaired. Like I mentioned, sometimes we can lubricate at this point, depending on if that instrument actually has like a hitch or a catch when we are manipulating it. Most lubrication happens mechanically within the washer disinfector, but if we do have a chance to lubricate and see if that does help with the ease of use for those hinged instruments, we can apply it manually at this point as well during the inspection and assembly phase. Moving on to packaging considerations. A lot of times when we talk about packaging considerations, we talk about the exterior part of it, but there's a lot of things that happen interior as well that we want to make sure that we're protecting the instruments from moving around, that they're not actually going to cause damage if they get transported. So when we think about packaging and how we wrap or contain instruments, we make sure that we are able to select packaging that is the most appropriate for each item. Apply the select packaging in a manner that ensures success of the sterilization process, and then protection of the item during storage and transport back to the operating room. Anytime we talk about any packaging contents, it always has to be a validated product. So making sure that we have things like manufacturer IFUs. And then when we talk about practices, we talk about things that are approved through the standards and best practices as well. So first up is organization. There are some different options that you can use to help organize instruments within an instrument set. So using things like instrument sleeve or organizational pouches can help with ease of transition from sterile processing to transport to the operating room. So it can help actually set the OR up for success with those organization of the instruments. They're not kind of shifting around and moving around everywhere. Another common way to organize instruments is by paper pouches. Paper can contain cellulose, so it cannot be used in gas plasma, or if you have vaporized hydrogen peroxide, any sort of sterilizer for hydrogen peroxide, making sure that you have the manufacturer IFU. They always have to be medical grade, so none of those like sandwich bags that you find if you bring your sandwich to work. Things have to be validated and have to have that manufacturer IFU for the validation and the sterilization parameters you want to use it in. The other thing is that often there's a lot of instruments that get placed inside of here, and we must have an indicator inside to indicate that it actually, the steam does penetrate and it is hitting all parts of those instruments. Next up, when we talk about large amount of instruments that are inside of sets, things like instrument stringers can be a really easy way to organize instruments. The AAMI ST79 states this: ratcheted instruments should be unlatched. Racks, pins, stringers, or other specifically designed devices can be used to hold instruments in an unlatched position. So as you can see on the screen here, there's a lot of different options. The really important and critical part is that you work with the sterile processing department to make sure that staff in the operating room know how to open these different stringers. As you can see, there's a lot of different kinds that are out there, and making sure that you understand how it's organized onto that stringer set can really help with efficiencies in the sterile field setup. Last is instrument identification. Like I already mentioned, we check and inspect if we have instrument tape on those instruments. Other things like 2D barcode matrix on the instruments. So, QR codes have kind of taken over our lives the last 2 years. But anything that you have a way to identify that instrument at the instrument level, not just within that instrument set, making sure that we always are inspecting it, making sure that they are organized in a way that ensures that you have all the instruments that you need in your set. AAMI ST79 does state that if you do have instrument tape, that we always inspect for flaws, damage, debris, any residue, anything like that that could disrupt the sterilization of that instrument. So something that we have to think about in sterile processing. It does help, again, with minimize the confusion of contents within a set, and it does help with communication too, of understanding what instruments are proposed to be in that set and what is needed for that procedure. Next, I want to talk about some ancillary products when we talk about wrapping a set. Using things like single-use corner protectors or reusable corner protectors, tray liners, either internally to cushion instruments or externally, anything like that that will help allow sterilant penetration, but again, tears and rips or snags on the wrap. Something like this can help support that we have better practices when it comes to anything that could potentially impede that sterile barrier. If you're having issues with that at your facility, always address the kind of wrap that you have at your facility, the weight of the wrap. Additionally, if you have any of these ancillary products like corner protectors or tray liners, make sure that you are optimizing that tray every single time. Oftentimes it takes the operating room communicating that with the sterile processing department so that we can work together and bridge that gap of what's really going wrong. Why do we have so many rips and tears in our wraps? Is there something that we need to reassess and reevaluate with our practice currently? Indicator tape, when we're talking about wrap, it is considered best practice because they are made specifically to withstand sterilization. So not just any old general masking tape. Will work. We want to make sure that we have things that are validated for the practice that we're doing. Oftentimes it changes colors, and not oftentimes, I should say every single time it changes color. And this indicates that it's been exposed to a sterilization process. It's best practice because it helps avoid mixing up processed and unprocessed packaging. The big thing with sterilization tape is it's a type 1 or a level 1 indicator. All that means is that it changes color when it actually has been exposed to sterilization. It does not provide proof that adequate sterilization of the packaging contents has occurred. And at the end of this presentation, we are going to talk about specifics of what to look for in the operating room, not only externally, but internally with those type 5 chemical indicators. When we talk about sterile packaging, the inspection and assembly is really critical because not only are we inspecting those instruments at the specific instrument level, but we move really quickly into assembling them all together, making sure we have every bit of instrument that we need to have in there, and really how can we optimize that instrument set that we've just assembled all the way through sterile packaging, sterilization, sterile storage, and then back to operating room use. So not only is internally just as important, making sure we have everything checked, that it's working appropriately, that we have everything in there, but that we've picked the right sterile packaging for those instruments as well. So when you talk about objectives of sterile packaging, we want to make sure that we have something that allows penetration of the chosen sterilant, compatible with any and all any other requirements of the specific sterilization process, for example, drying. Maintain the sterility of the package contents until it's open, that it can open aseptically, and that different types of packagings are needed for different sterilization methods, which is why we often see in the department different kinds of tape, different kind of peel pouches, depending on what these instruments are going through. That is specifically designed for sterile packaging, and that it is approved by the FDA. FDA classifies sterilization packaging as a Class 2 medical device. So making sure that we actually are having the proper information provided to us when we onboard these kind of products into our department. So we have the manufacturer IFU, and that they have all the proper validation for the products through the processes that they are going through. So here are some of those quick do's and don'ts when we talk about package assembly. So instruments are placed on a stainless steel heat tolerated plastic or anodized aluminum tray with a perforated or mesh bottom to allow that sterilant penetration. That we use tray liners or other approved absorption products that may be used to absorb moisture and provide cushion for those instruments, specifically at those corners. And that we have to include that sterility indicator. Typically in general sets, we see a type 5 indicator so that we can say, yes, once you guys open these in the OR, that yes, they have been properly exposed to the sterilant that they've been put into and that they've been approved and validated for. Here's some don'ts. Peel pouches are not recommended to be used inside of instrument trays. Reason being is that sterilant is penetrated through the paper side. That plastic side stops that sterilant. So if you put it inside of an instrument set, whether it be rigid container or a wrap set, you really do not know if you can actually get that sterilant penetrating all the way through on that plastic side. So if it's sitting on top of instruments, it may impede sterilization from hitting all parts of that instrument set. Additionally, gauze squares should not be used as additional packaging material or wicking material. This can throw off surgical counts, and ultimately it's not been validated to be used for something like that. So there are better products to be used within that set for absorption and for protection. So there's a couple different types of sterile packaging that we're going to cover today. When we talk about sterile barrier systems and microbial barriers, the ST79 states this: minimum package that prevents ingress of microorganisms and allows for aseptic presentation of the product at the point of use. A sterile barrier system should provide a barrier to microorganisms during, get this, sterilization, processing, handling, distribution, transport, storage, and maintain protection for the sterile contents during storage and transportation to the point of use. Holy cow. Additionally, it should also resist tearing or puncturing, maintain protection for the sterile contents through all these processes again. There's a lot that goes into the choices that we make in sterile processing to maintain sterility, and that we're assembling sets so that we can optimize our time and efficiencies all the way to the operating room. So the three that we'll cover today are rigid containers, wrap sets, and peel pouches. So how do we even measure the destruction of all microbial life? Well, sometimes it's something that we can't necessarily measure at the point of assembling things, but generally a dirty instrument has the potential of hosting hundreds of living and multiplying microbes. So after disinfection, that number reduces, and often the goal of sterilization is have the potential reduced to as close to nothing as possible. So this is called the 10 to the 6 or 10 to the negative 6 or 6 log reduction, meaning that there's 1 in a million chance of a living microorganism on a sterilized instrument after sterilization. So like I said, this is not something we can necessarily measure in sterile processing, but when we use all the right products that we're supposed to be using and do all the right processes, this is the goal of sterilization. So briefly, just touching on rigid container systems, there's a lot of different components to a rigid container system. They are box-like structures with a sealable and a removable lid. They often have filters for microbial barrier and sterilant penetration. This is something that a department should train on to make sure that we can inspect those different filters so there isn't any punctures or holes in it actually before we have a patient come into the room. Next up is we have that inner basket that you can easily take out for not only for sterile processing, but also for the operating room to make sure that you guys can easily move things around. Last is oftentimes we see rigid container systems that are specifically designed for the organization of instrumentation. So these are things that are specifically made for a specific product, which is often what we see in the department. Peel pouches. Peel pouches are used for small instruments and lightweight items. Sterilization penetration, like I said, is through that paper side. Peel pouches are often there for those quick grab instruments. So if something was missing or if you needed to add an instrument to a set, that maybe wasn't on the pick list initially, these are things that you can quick grab right in that sterile area. So the success of a peel pouch assembly or a peel pouch policy is ultimately that we're protecting delicate and sharp instruments within sets with tip protectors. So when we are peel packing instruments, advocate for using tip protectors when applicable. So the big things that you'll see tip caps on are sharp or curved instruments that could puncture or impede not only that peel pack, but it could also maybe potentially harm someone that's grabbing that peel pouch. If you're ever in the sterile packing area, or if you're ever in the sterile area and you see something punctured or broken through a certain field of either the paper side or the plastic side, please bring that back to sterile processing. Do not use it on that patient. There is one thing I quickly want to note. Back in 2020, herein, which is the Association for Perioperative Room Nurses, came out with a statement that said no more clear or colorless tip protectors should be used in the department. Reason being is there's a risk for retained surgical items, or RSIs. This doesn't mean that you should go down to sterile processing and tell them to throw every single clear or colorless tip cap away. What this means is that you should be working with that department, sterile processing and operating room, to try to find a solution. So something that's tinted or colored should be used on those instruments. So ultimately, when we're talking about a good peel pouch item, it looks something like this. That we have the right size peel pouch. We have about 1 inch around that whole instrument so it can move around. We have the right size tip cap that stays on that instrument through the whole sterilization cycle into the sterile storage area and then back up to the operating room. We have the right indicator in there, and you can actually see if it passed or if it hasn't passed. And then any sort of tape placement, sticker placement, identification statement placement should all be on that plastic side. It shouldn't be on that paper side. So this is kind of the good. Again, this is the bad. So if you ever see anything like this in that sterile storage area, please pull it and bring it to the sterile processing department. We never want to have instruments that are stressing the corners. Again, that could help if you're moving it around, maybe pop open that seal. On the bottom, every time you see a seal, whether it be a self-seal like this kind of peel pouch or something that is sealed at the facility, there should never be any sort of holes or any sort of kinks in it. It should be nice and flat. Anything that has this little space or those little buckling points, microorganisms can make their way in. Gaps are bad. So if you ever see anything on the right, please, again, bring it back to sterile processing and have them reprocess it. And my last example here, if you ever see something like this with gauze squares in it, like I mentioned, 4x4s are something that you count pre-procedure and post-procedure. They are not meant to protect a tip of an instrument, and it can totally throw off the counts after a procedure is ended too if there's extra gauze squares in the area. Please send them back. We are not supposed to be using makeshift protection in the department, so it could cause harm to you, patient, and the whole experience. The last barrier I want to talk about is non-woven wrap. So like I mentioned, when choosing a sterile barrier system, we want to make sure we ensure the product allows for air removal to permit sterile penetration of the packaging contents, provide a barrier to microorganisms during that sterilization process all the way through, resist to any tears or punctures, so want to make sure that you have something that is flexible and strong for your department, allow for complete seal that is tamper evident and provides seal integrity, maintain protection for sterile contents during storage and transport, allow aseptic presentation, all things we kind of covered, but the last few things is, non-linting and making sure that it's compatible with all the intended uses. Not only do we want to make sure that we have all those things covered, but additionally, the things that we consider in sterile processing is the weight of an item. So if you're ever looking at an instrument set and you're thinking right now, man, we have a ton of things that actually get tears or punctures in it, and it's this one set consistently, it could be the weight of the item that you are trying to sterilize. So anything else that you might be thinking about here, take a look at the weight of the sterilization wrap. One way to do that is work with the sterile processing department. If you find tears or if you find punctures consistently in a set, let them know. This is something where we should be absolutely tracking something like this. So always work with them. If you have any issues, please let them know. We don't know what we don't know. So if you don't tell us and you constantly have those issues, that can be where often communication barrier breakdowns can happen. Wrap technique. So I don't know if you've had an opportunity to go down to sterile processing and see the ability to wrap an instrument. It's quite a technique, I'm going to say that. I've had an opportunity to wrap a lot of instrument sets in my career, and it is tough. It's really tricky depending on the size and the shape of that instrument set that you're trying to wrap. So again, that's where that flexibility and strength of the wrap can really come in, and it can really help minimize, again, any punctures or tears. But here's that step-by-step technique. It's called an envelope fold. Everything should always have 2 layers to it. Something like you see here where it has dual color that you can easily see one side versus another side. And everything wrapped should look really nice, clean, and crisp. It breaks down to everything, even the package labeling. So when we talk about making sure that we have success in assembly and inspection of instruments, it's making sure that we have the proper labeling on that set. So after we've inspected the instrument, we found the right way to protect it, create that microbial and sterile barrier, whether it be rigid containers, peel pouches, or a wrap. We want to make sure we have right packaging labeling on there too. Just want to say this at the very end of this thing is the slangs, terms, and nicknames should be avoided. I work in a sterile processing department, so I know that there are often a disconnect between the operating room and the sterile processing when it comes to even certain instruments. So making sure that we always are standardizing abbreviations and terms and even names of instruments and instrument sets will really help with that bridging of that communication gap. But these are things directly from the ST79 that should be called out on a label. And you may think this is a lot of things, but ultimately some of those little labels and stickers do absolutely cover each one of these things. So description of the package contents often is just the title or name of the instrument set. The initial of the package assembler so that can be tracked back to that particular person. And oftentimes this is done within tracking systems already anyways when you scan that instrument set. Making sure we have a lot control number, identification of sterilizer and cycle used. This is because if a sterilizer fails or we have any sort of failure in sterilization, we can track back all those different instruments that were sterilized in that sterilizer. Again, the data sterilization kind of affects that same thing, making sure that we constantly have consistency and that we always have controllables so we can go back and find those instrument sets. And then requesting department or surgeon's name may be included. Oftentimes that's for loan sets that come out from outside of our regular sets that we reprocess. And then lastly is assigned storage location so that we know where to find them, not only in sterile processing, but additionally for the operating room. Moving into storage. Storage is important that we're constantly inspecting instrument sets at this phase as well, because a lot of things can go wrong really quickly in sterile storage. So this is kind of a quick true or false. Obviously, you guys can't talk to me, so we'll make sure that you guys can say to yourself at your computers right now. But true or false, temperature and humidity are irrelevant in maintaining sterility of sterile packages. It's false. Temperature should be between 72 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit and less than 60% humidity. Now, this doesn't necessarily come from AAMI or herein guidelines. It's actually an adopted range and percent from ANSI, ASHRAE, and ASH, which has to do with facilities and facility HVAC systems. So this often is outside of the control of a sterile processing department. So we have to make sure that we build those relationships and that communication with the facilities management and maintenance teams. So if anything goes out of range in this department or this area of the department, that we can quickly get it fixed, because it can really affect the way that sterile packaging and microbial barriers that we've created potentially for that patient. So when we talk about sterility maintenance and storage, we really want to make sure that we're always trained on how to handle these items, navigate our way through the sterile storage area. That's where it's really critical that those locations on that label match to actually where they are in the sterile storage area. And then last, there are some things that can really affect the way that the sterile packaging can stay sterile until they are used on a patient. So primary conditions that can adversely affect sterile packaging include moisture and liquid or fluid contamination, dirt, dust, debris, physical damage to that package. If you find something in the sterile storage area and it maybe isn't something that you need for your current case, but you do see it, please pull it and bring it to sterile processing and track that you've pulled it there or brought it to that department. Reason being is that if you let it just sit there, maybe someone else didn't see that tear or that puncture and they actually use that set on a patient. It could be a chance for them to maybe get an infection, or we are using something that we really shouldn't be using on a patient. Next, I want to talk a little bit about event-related sterility. Traditionally, sterility of package has been thought of as kind of a time-related thing, which means a package is considered sterile until a certain time or date. But recently, the Joint Commission and herein now recognize sterility as event-related. So sterilized packages must maintain their content sterility until they are intentionally opened. Event-related sterility acknowledges that microbial contamination of a sterile package is caused by an event, such as improper handling or transport, rather than by time alone. So, like I said, if you see something that's broken or torn within that sterile storage area, please pull it and don't let it just sit there. Next up, I just want to talk about storage considerations. So stock arrangement, arrange so that items are not crushed, bent, or compromised, that they're easy to locate. You have your first in, first out, and the goal is provide minimum pack handling while allowing that first in, first out rotation. So here's a really easy image. Anything that's super duper heavy over that 25-pound benchmark should be right in the middle so that you can easily transport it to a cart. Anything that's light that you can easily grab, that's okay to grab overhead, just go ahead and put that at the top. Anything that's in that middle weight range, putting that at the bottom so you can, again, easily transport it or maybe pick it up a little bit. But it's all for ergonomics and safety of people that are handling these items. So last, I just want to bridge the education gap between OR and RAP, specifically because the things that surprised me, even when I was working in sterile processing, I didn't realize that the operating room team knew a lot about this. So I think it's really cool that we can have this commonality, and I think that oftentimes we don't realize how much we know about each other's practices. So when we talk about OR and RAP, just like sterile processing, OR staff must confirm that the external indicators have passed. Here the lines, as you can see on the tape, have darkened, indicating a pass. Check the expiration date and do an initial brief visual inspection to confirm the wrap integrity is intact. Next, the package must be opened by a non-scrubbed in, non-sterile person in a way that maintains the sterility of the set inside. First, open away from yourself, then the sides are open. Finally, the last corner is open toward the opener. This is either done on a stand or a table, or open directly to a scrubbed in person to hold once open. It is not to be set on the sterile field yet. Prior to placing the tray on the sterile field, the internal indicator is visually inspected. If it has failed, the set is considered contaminated. This indicator appears to have passed, so it's good to move on to the next step. Still, prior to placing the instruments tray on the sterile field, the non-scrub person must inspect the wrap by holding it up in the air to the light to evaluate for any holes, tears, or shearing that may happen. If there are holes, tears, the set is considered contaminated, and if the tray was passed to a scrub person, any part of the surgical tech or scrub person that has come in contact with the tray is considered contaminated as well. So material can affect how we can see holes or tears, anything that has a dual color or even that diamond pattern. So something that looks different than a puncture or a hole can make tears or even punctures easier to see or to spot when you're inspecting it in the OR. So it's definitely something to consider, not only the weight of the wrap, but also the shape and diamond pattern, as you can see here. Something that's different from an actual hole may really help to visually see something that maybe would be hard to see with a different kind or style of wrap. But when we're looking at this individual piece here, this piece looks like it's good to go, so it's ready to move on. The other thing that I think that's really cool is that we set things up in sterile processing for success in the sterile field. So we try to organize things in a way that are easy for you guys to grab and move into that sterile field. So assembling a sterile field is often kind of our space that we assemble the sets post-inspection. So if rack 1, stringer 1 is set up consistently, for example, so like, for example, everyone in SPD sets it up the same way, this has the potential to dramatically reduce the time it requires in the OR to organize, count, and prepare the sterile field, especially if the instrument set list in the instrument tracking system is created, modified by a team effort between OR and SPD, and the OR's instrument count sheets are kept up to date in alignment with SPD's instrument set list. So we all have to be able to work together. I know sometimes our programs don't communicate, so if there's ways that we can modify and update the system for OR, and that also reflects in that pick list or sheet list that we have for sterile processing, it really helps increase the likelihood of a swift setup and that we're not constantly missing an instrument. So sterile field setups and tables can be as small as a Mayo stand to as large as requiring 2 full setups with multiple tables and scrubs, things that I'm sure a lot of you are really common or familiar with, but these are all things that sterile processing department, we don't necessarily know the impact or the effect that we have on a surgical case setup. So making sure that when we assemble things, like I mentioned, we want to make sure that things are nice and organized so that you guys can have a really nice organized sterile field. One thing to note is one thing that doesn't differ between sterile processing and OR is that one dirty item or instrument will contaminate the entire sterile field. There's kind of a hard rule in surgical instrument tray that is placed on the back table, and then you find a hole or a tear found in the wrap, that whole setup now is considered contaminated. So it's really critical when we talk about wrapping instruments, especially a lot of wrap instruments that come into the department are these heavy loan sets, so ortho sets or implant sets, that we have the right size weight and the right size wrap, making sure that we can minimize any sort of tear or puncture that can potentially ruin a whole sterile setup. There's a really easy way if you can't necessarily go and communicate with sterile processing department. You can use simple things as tags to help communicate specific information about instruments. Things like broken, quick turnover, priority, repair, sharpen, that can bridge that communication gap really easily, especially if you don't have a lot of time with turnovers or sets or quick turnovers of instruments. Something really easy like a tag can really communicate something really quickly. Next is tracking systems. I know a lot of facilities are moving towards tracking systems. It helps with inventory management, understanding where the trays are within the reprocessing cycle, and easily track instruments not only within a whole set, but at a specific instrument level too. So we talked a little bit about some of these things, but there are a lot of enemies of surgical instruments that will really help not only with operating room, but sterile processing. So anytime anything like this can help minimize that reprocessing cycle. So if you let blood dry on instruments, it takes us a lot longer to reprocess instruments. Soaking instruments in saline, soaking instruments in hard water. That can also affect our inspection of these instruments. Long-term soaking can damage instruments, improper size and material of cleaning brushes, which is often on sterile processing. Cleaning solutions, lubricants, hard water to dry on these instruments, rougher handling or dumping of instruments, improper use of instruments, not only in sterile processing, but in the operating room. And then last is cleaning or sterilizing instruments with ratchets closed. Things that we run into a lot in sterile processing. So anything that can help with inspection and assembly, prepping us for success for that decontamination process at the point of use can really help optimize inspection and assembly of instruments and getting good, clean instruments every single time into the operating room. We need to protect that investment, right? Like I said, if we don't protect the investment, it can be harmful to the patient. The hospital may actually lose money, and surgery can often delay for cases. So we want to make sure that we prolong the life of surgical instruments through that preventative maintenance program. Any sort of help that operating room can do will always help us for sterile processing and vice versa. It helps reduce costs related to replacements or repairs. It helps protect that investment, surgeon satisfaction, and it oftentimes helps to improve OR efficiency. But we never want to recreate the wheel. So if you're thinking to yourself, I feel like we could really have an opportunity to talk about maybe the products that we're currently using. So if you're thinking right now, wow, we have a lot of issues with our rep, we get a lot of punctures, we get a lot of tears, something like that, always go to the source of information from the guidelines, from the herein guidelines, EME guidelines. There's a lot of different ways to access that, but also working in a multidisciplinary team is a really great way to bridge that gap between the sterile processing department and the operating room. If we kind of silos ourselves and we don't actually work together, often those lack of communication, or that ability to not actually talk about ways we can improve our efficiencies, or inefficiencies, I should say, it can really affect the way that we do our jobs, and it can affect patient safety. So see if you guys can start looking at those things a little bit more specifically, going to the source, like I said, herein or EME. There's online in-department access, so actual hard paper. You can always access it on your phone too and start communicating about that. It's really our patient, and the stigma of kind of that us versus them has to kind of be pushed aside, and we really need to start making things a lot better and more efficient in our departments. We're quote people at Key Surgical, so I'm gonna leave you with one final quote here. Coming together is beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. So I just wanna say thank you for being a part of the webinar today. I'm really honored that you got to choose your time today to be with me. So keep working together, keep coming together, and making sure that we work together for our patient and their families that are waiting in pre-op, in the OR, post-op, and making sure that we're successfully getting instruments assembled and prep for sterile success. Here's some information. If you want to contact us, please email us at education@keysurgical.com. Additionally, Michelle Lemons is our OR clinical educator. She's actually spoken a couple of times for OR Today. She's a great resource too, and we constantly work together to, again, bridge that gap between sterile processing and the operating room. And she's a great wealth of knowledge when it comes to operating room systems and processes too. Like I mentioned at the beginning, if you're looking for a little bit more in-depth knowledge of all those steps before we actually get to inspection and assembly, you can always go to keysurgical.com/education. Search for that. We have a webinar or a course that contains just about every one of those tiles in that reprocessing cycle. Additionally, if you love listening to podcasts, Michelle and I are co-hosts of Knowledge Unlocked, hosted by Key Surgical. You can find us anywhere that you listen to podcasts, and we'd love to hear any ideas that you have for future podcasts, what you think of our current podcasts, and see if what you kind of think that we're talking about is relatable to what you're doing in your departments. Do I have any questions out there for our live Q&A?
Absolutely. We had a couple that came in during the presentation, so we're looking at about 10 minutes before you hit the 60-minute mark, so I'm going to jump right into the first one. Jamie, what can the operating room staff do to assist with instrumentation when you discussed a proactive plan versus a reactive plan?
That's a great question, and I kind of addressed it in the webinar when I talk about, we all run into these different kind of enemies on a daily, hard water soaking things for a long period of time, letting blood dry on the instruments. So any sort of prep that you do, post-op or intraoperatively can really help with the longevity and life of those instruments. And like I said, communication tools, so using tags or just direct line of communication, emails, anything like that, to help bridge that gap of understanding that instrumentation is often our commonality. So if we can come together with understanding better practices for that, and any sort of extra prep or help at that OR's point of use is really helpful for us all the way through the reprocessing cycle.
Thank you for that. And before I jump to the next question, I did want to share a shout out from one of the attendees, which I think is a great testimonial. Not necessarily a question though, but this attendee loves your podcast that you do with Michelle. They say the topics are great. They love what you address, and they always learn something new. So there's a great testimonial for other attendees to tune in also.
Wonderful. It's so nice to hear people are listening to our podcast. I love it.
Yes, people are hearing you. Let's see if we can get through one more question before we run out of time. Should we be documenting if we find rips or tears in a wrap?
Yeah, this is something that I've been kind of thinking about a little bit more, actually. So it's funny that someone asked that question. But, when we have tears or rips, specifically in the department that I work in, often the OR staff just brings it and tells us, and we're like, oh, okay. And then we just reprocess it, right? We don't really ask many questions. So if we can start documenting that and understanding a little bit, like I said, if there's a common instrument set that constantly comes back, ripped, has tears, has punctures in it, that might be where we want to assess, hey, do we have the right weight for this wrap? Are we using the right size wrap? Why are these constantly coming back to us? That might be a space that we can understand it if we document that kind of thing, rather than just be like, we'll just send it back. And especially in sterile processing, we just see that and we're like, okay, we need to reprocess it. But if we can start tracking and documenting that, we might find gaps, and maybe we need to assess kind of the products that we're currently using and see if we need to find something that's a little bit more strong, has a little bit better flexibility, and something that can maybe protect that set a little bit better.
With that, we will go ahead and start to wrap up today's webinar. Jamie, I can't thank you enough for such a great presentation. The information that you shared has certainly resonated with the OR Today community. Thank you again. And of course, a big thank you to our sponsor today, Key Surgical. Again, I'm going to encourage all of our attendees, visit their URL, their website, learn more about them. It is keysurgical.com. Always a reminder to the attendees that you can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey. That survey is going to arrive via email in 1 hour from now. You must complete the survey to receive the certificate, and you will be able to download and print your certificate from your computer. If you have any questions or challenges along the way, reach out to us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. Do check ortodaywebinars.live to see a calendar of upcoming events. We hope to see you back soon. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.